Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to go over some of the differences between trying to code a game in C# for Godot versus Gdscript, with an emphasis of talking about C#. So we'll talk a bit about taking a concept that you would write in Gdscript and moving it over to C#. So first I want to point out though, if you're going to do anything with C# in Godot, you have to be using the mono versions of Godot, which will include C# support. So let's take a look at this abstract player class written in Gdscript. So the idea here is that you might want to have multiple implementations of what a player would actually do. And you would have this player class as your base class, and you can extend from that by maybe having like a ranger player, a fighter player, or whatever, and they have different implementations of all of these different methods. Now you'll see that when we do Gdscript, if you declare a function, you have to give it something. So you could write push error not implemented, which is kind of what I've been doing lately, just to note that this is supposed to be a abstract, quote unquote, class. So we haven't actually written the implementation of the function. So if we call win without actually writing the final win function on the class that inherits from player, then it's going to give us the push error message. So in a sense, what you'd be doing here is overriding the win function in your child class by writing the same function name and then giving it a different version of what the win function actually does, which would just replace this entirely. Now, you can see that you can also write a function and you can just have it say pass. But if you call a function that depends on a player class, and so it tries to run lose function and it passes here, then it's just going to do nothing and it won't give you any indication that basically nothing happened and it just skipped over this function. So that's why I would write something like push error, right? You'll also notice here that if you give a return type to your functions in Gdscript, that you do have to return something for that value. So that could either be the actual value, or you can get away with null in a lot of cases if it's an object. But you do have to return something. So you have to have some basic implementation. Even if it's meant to be an abstract class, it's not really an abstract class because you're not writing abstract functions with no implementation. You have to have some code here. So because this is technically a node script, I could put it on the guy right here. I can click on it. You can see I have the export variable for the stats resource here. So technically it has some of the functionality that I would want in the final script, but it's not going to work until I extend from this class. So I'm going to create a new Gdscript here, and I'll just call it something like wizard_player.gd. Okay, so this wizard player is going to extend from player, and I might want to give it a class name. So wizard player. So in C#, every time you declare an object, it's always going to have a class. So when we create this class, I can technically just drag wizard player onto guy. Okay, and I click here, and you'll see that it still has the fields from the player class. So it inherits everything from player. So here you can see one of the places where with Gdscript, you'd have a bit of a lack of clarity. So unless you know that the player class is meant to have its functions overwritten, you wouldn't really know about that. So if you call wizardPlayer.when, it's going to be using the player win, the player lose, because we haven't overwritten these functions in the child class. So we can implement them now in wizard player if we just copy and paste them in over here, and then we just give it a different output. So for instance, win can just be returned true, and lose can be returned false. So we never lose and we always win. And then down here, get points. Maybe we need a points field. So I'll do @export var points, and this will be an integer. We'll just default that to start at 0. So now I want the return points to be just return points down here, and so on and so forth. So we can click up here and we'll see that we have that new export variable. So over in C#, there's a concept called interfaces, where when you haven't actually declared the implementation for how winning should work or losing should work for any type of player. So we don't know how this is actually going to work with an interface. We're just basically declaring what anything that implements IPlayer should be able to do. There's also actual abstract classes inside of C#. So here's basically the function declarations, but we have no idea about the implementation. So in C#, if we want to create the actual player, then we'll create a new class that implements IPlayer interface. And you'll notice that for C#, I'm actually using Visual Studio Code over here. So with C#, you really can't edit it in the Godot editor. in Godot 4, as far as I know still, you can't really debug it in external IDEs like Visual Studio Code. However, there is the debugger inside of Gdscript, but if I had the option of choosing, I'd rather debug inside of Visual Studio Code. So you can still debug C# code using Visual Studio Code. That's one advantage, I would say. So let's create a new C# class for the actual player. So I'm going to right-click on my C# scripting folder, and I'm going to create a new script. So we'll change language to C#. And for the naming of your scripts, what I've noticed is that it's actually really important that you use PascalCase for your class. I call it player, and if it was like wizard player, it would be wizard player, and the first letter of wizard and player a capital, so that's your PascalCase. But if we were doing Godot script, the standard convention is more like wizard_player.gd. So the reason you need to make it PascalCase, like wizardplayer.cs, is that when we go ahead and we create our classes, that in C#, when you are creating your classes, the naming of your classes is going to be the same. It's going to be PascalCase. So wizardPlayer needs to match the file name if you want things like export variables to actually show up in the inspector. So if I made wizardPlayer snakecase over here, the variables wouldn't pop up over here like you would expect. So that's important. So we have our wizardPlayer class, which is of type node, but we're also going to have it implement the IPlayer interface. So when we put this in Visual Studio Code, you'll see that it'll tell us about all of the functions we haven't actually implemented. And what's nice here is that we can just do a control period, implement interface, and now we have all of these functions that we were supposed to write, and they just pop up here so that we can write them for our player character. So I consider that pretty cool. So we still have a pop-up up here to get that last function. So we want IPlayer.validate setup. So I'll implement that explicitly. Okay, and then we have the functions we need to implement. So in C#, obviously, you have exceptions. So you don't really need to do something like a print to console that you have an error. Okay, so pretty easily we know which functions we've got to write, and we got their stub code automatically put in there. You also notice for C# that we can have a base class, and we can have an interface and multiple interfaces at the same time. So both of these will work as types. So if I wanted to use the wizard player for something, I could use its interface, IPlayer, as a qualifying type, or I could use the Godot node as a type as well. So for instance, in that function down here is allied with IPlayer target player. The target player, we don't know actually which type of player it is. So we are writing the wizard player now, but it might be a different type of player. It might be a fighter player. And all we need to know about IPlayer is that it's going to have these functions implemented at some point when you have the final class written out inside of wizard player, fighter player. So let's say, for instance, in Gdscript, we had an array of nodes, and we wanted to get some piece of data off of each of those nodes. So we could say something like var nodes here, and that's going to be an array of node type. So basically, on each element in here, anything in there should be a node, and we can execute any node-based functions on it. Okay, so for get points, let's count the number of nodes that have some arbitrary value. So I'll say count valid, and we'll say equals nodes.filter. So this allows us to run a callable function against this list of nodes. So that could mean you already have a function written and you put it in here to filter out the list. And for the ones that return true, it'll keep that node into the list, and the ones that are false, it would remove it. Or we can write it inline. So inside of here, let's write a inline function. So I'll say function, and the parameter will be node of type node. So declaring that just allows us to easily see what the node can do. Okay, semicolon, and then we write our function code. So we'll say, and we want a Boolean expression here to filter the list. So we'll say return node dot, let's say process mode is equal to, or is not equal to process mode disabled. So if I expand it all like that, it can look a little bit like that. So I don't think that actually has to all be on the same line. I think something more like that for clarity Makes it a little bit easier to read. But either you can write a function you declared outside, or you can just write a small one inside of here. So this supposedly would just basically count all of the nodes that don't have their process mode and disabled. So process mode would be this property right over here. So I just wanted to show an example of how you could do something like that, filtering an array based on some arbitrary little code, and then you get a new array of what you need. Oh, and since I filtered the array, I think I would also want to get the size on the results. So filter is going to return an array, and then we can get the size of that array. So chaining a function there, we filter it, then we get the size, that's our valid count. And we can declare here the actual type here if we want int as well. So in Gdscript, your variables can be typed or untyped. So if we go over to Visual Studio Code for Wizard Player and just do something similar, let's take a look at how that would be different. So first off, the var nodes here, let's just say that this is a private variable. In Gdscript, you would say underscore nodes, indicating that this is meant to only be used privately inside the class. So I update the names down there, and it'll work fine. So if I reference this class from another class, I'd still actually be able to access underscore nodes variable. You're just supposed to kind of know that you're not supposed to mess around with the private variables because they're private for a reason. However, in C#, the accessibility of a property or a field is going to be declared and enforced. So if I want a private property, it would look more like this. Private array, and we can type the array node. Note that when you're specifying the type of an array, you would use the less than, greater than symbols to wrap the class type and typing. So this is typing the array. But you can see in Gdscript, you would put the square brackets. So basically the same idea here. So in C#, we would declare using the public protected or private keyword, the accessibility of every field, property, or function. So here, if I want to make a private property, I would say private, and then the array type would be array node. And because it's a property, I want to have the first letter be capitals. You'll notice that also applies to function names. A lot more stuff is going to be using this PascalCase inside of C#. You can see that I underscored the validate setup to basically give an indication that this is private. But that just seems to be a naming convention that Godot C# uses as well. But there's no technical need to have the underscore since all of the functions and methods are going to have their accessibility keyword in front of it anyway. Okay, so we have the array node up here at the top. Since it's a property, I want to have a getter and a setter, so I can just use the default ones like that. And if we go over here, we'll see that the non-generic type array cannot be used with type arguments. Well, that's because we have to use the Godot collections namespace. So if I do a control period here and using Godot collections, then that's going to get rid of that error message. So we actually are pulling the definition for this type of array from Godot collection. So different namespaces might have different definitions for what a class type is. So that's something you'd kind of have to watch out for a little bit while doing C#. Godot script doesn't have namespaces, it only has class names. By having different namespaces, you might have 2 or 3 different objects that are technically called array, but if you hover over it, you can see that that array definition is coming from Godot collections instead of just Godot, and those 2 namespaces might have a different version of array, so you kind of have to be a little careful about that. It's not really a big deal though. So now that this array property is private, we would not be able to use the getter or setter from outside of this wizard player class from any other C# script, and C# will actually enforce that, as opposed to Godot script where it's just kind of implied and you have to make sure that your code respects it, because you won't just get an error message that says, oh, you've been blocked from accessing it. So one of the other things regarding that I do like about C# is that you can actually make the property public over here. And then you can say that only the setter function is private. So you have a private set and a get, which doesn't have its accessibility declared, which means it's going to use this one over here, which means that getting the values of this array property are public, but setting them are actually private. So doing that in Gdscript isn't really a thing. We could say that we have this array of nodes, right? And we can still make a getter function. So we could say get, and this will just return nodes. So this technically, even if you have the underscore here, this is still quote unquote public. It can still be used from anywhere. And we could do something like set value. And if you want to prevent other scripts from setting the value here, you could do something like when they call the setter function, you just push a error, which would say cannot be set by setter function. And so you can like have a warning that way. And so the setter gets called and you don't actually set the nodes to the value, which would just be a default setter. So if you just skip over that, then technically nodes won't be set and you'll just get an error message. So you can block people that way, but that doesn't stop you from being able to just go into the setter function and call it anyway. So that's definitely something there. So I mentioned a little bit ago that in Gdscript you can use filter and give it a function in order to basically take an array of nodes and make a smaller array based on some criteria, returning the Boolean for each one getting a true or false. So in C# you can do something really simpler using what's called LINQ. And I'll just show a really basic example of it real quick. So if I wanted to count, let's say, the number of nodes in the array, and actually I mean for this to be called nodes. Array is a stupid name there. So let's do basically the same thing I did here for get points with get points in C#. So we have our array of nodes here, which I actually want to be called nodes, not array. That makes a lot more sense now. And let's, for get points, okay, so I'm going to return nodes. So capital on the first letter, we're talking about the property. So this is going to call the getter on the property, which should return an array of node from the backing field. So we're returning nodes, and I want to use LINQ in order to filter it. So I would probably go ahead and use where here, which is one option of LINQ, which is pretty much like filter on the Gdscript array. But I want to point out that for collections in C#, you have a lot of options for LINQ. Many I actually don't know myself, but you can see you have a lot of options here for taking collections, merging them together, filtering them, or selecting items from them. And it's just a really handy way of manipulating things like arrays. So we want to do basically the Gdscript filter. So I'm going to do where. And so let's put in our little LINQ function with a lambda. So I'm going to do x, where x is the item that's going into here. I could actually make that a little bit more clear, something like a node. So we're grabbing a node, and then we're going to put that into the function. So what do we want to do with each of these nodes? Well, we want to figure out where something is true. So what are we checking to see if it's true to filter the array? We're doing node.processMode. Note that accessing the properties and the functions, everything is PascalCase, not snake case. So process mode, and we're going to check that that is equal, not equal to disabled. So any of the other process modes, like inherit, possible, win, paused, always, are valid, but not this disabled one. So this gives us our filtered array. So what do I want to do with that? I want to count it to get an integer. So I would just do .count. So I would just do a .count here, and that is a function. So we need the parentheses and a semicolon at the end. So in one line, basically, we filter the nodes based on the nodes that don't have the process mode disabled, and then we count them and return that as our points value. Okay, so pretty handy. There's different ways of doing basically the same thing. Just the syntax is a little bit different, but as long as you kind of get the concept, it works out more or less the same. You just kind of have to convert it in your mind, depending on what language you're working with. So I kind of glossed over the concept of an abstract class in C#. We have an interface here, which allows us to tell us what we need to define. So let's create an abstract class. So I'll just create a new file for C#, and I'll just call this a powernode.cs. Okay, I'm going to kind of copy this into the script here. So inside of here, we want to put abstract after public before partial, and we are going to be inheriting from node as the base class. So let's see, using Godot. Okay, and then we have our class implementation. So when we have an abstract class, that means that we don't expect that every piece of this class is actually implemented in this code that we're about to write down here. And actually I want to rename this to match my script name. So class power node. Okay. So obviously a base node is not abstract because you can use that in Godot, but this class, which builds on top of it, makes it abstract. So we're going to have some random stuff. So inside of here, we'll have a protected string, and I will call this power, and this will be defaulting to my power as the string. So this field is not abstract. So not everything inside of an abstract class has to be abstract and not implemented. So down here, I'll say something like public string, which is the return type, and we'll say double power, and no parameters. So just declare that right there. Now, normally you have to declare a body, which is the implementation of the function, but in C# you can do public abstract string double power, and now we don't have to actually say what this does until we create our node that inherits it. So on Wizard Player, I'm now going to change this node type to power node. So it's implementing IPlayer, but it's also a power node, and we get this error up here. Does not implement member power node dot double power. So let's do a control period and implement the abstract class. So now we have this function we have to actually implement. Now in power node, we add the protected string power. So there is no such thing as protected in Gdscript that I am aware of. So basically this means that any class that inherits from this class can access it, but classes that do not inherit from power node, outside classes, cannot access this string. So it's private to classes that don't inherit from power node. But in Wizard Player, because that is a power node, I can do return on power, and maybe I do power plus power, and that's how I double my power. So basically with C#, if you declare some stuff in one class, like a abstract function or an interface that the final class should have, and that final class actually inherits or implements those abstract classes or interfaces, then as long as the code compiles, you're guaranteed that those functions are actually going to exist inside of the final class. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to work, but it means they're going to exist at least. So I do like that aspect where, because things are being enforced, you're not just going to forget that there was supposed to be a function there. It's going to tell you, with the list of problems, everything that you actually need to do in order for things to compile. Okay, so speaking of compiling, if you want to run Gdscript, all you need to do is basically save the script and hit run. With C# code, as soon as you put C# code into your project, you have to build your project every time it's going to run, and whenever you make a change to your C# code. So for instance, let me throw Wizard Player CS onto this guy. I'll just drop that in there. Okay, so we can see for Wizard Player CS that there's no properties up here. I haven't actually exported any properties yet. So let's show how to do that actually now. So when you have a field or property and you want it to show up in the inspector, just like with Gdscript 4, you need to export it. So in C#, you do square brackets and you type in export. You hit Control S, you go back out, and you'll notice that it doesn't show up here because you have to build the project whenever you make an update if you want these exported fields to show up. That also means basically every time your project runs, it needs to rebuild all of the scripts, which can be a little bit of a pain. It means that it's going to take a little extra time whenever you need to test some changes. But you can see, just like Gdscript, you can get those Gdscript, you can still get that Godot functionality using tags like these. And now we have the array of nodes, so I could assign these. So in the inspector here, we can still assign it even though the setter is private. But if we tried to access this list of nodes and set it from another script during gameplay, that's not going to fly because this private is going to block that. So we can assign our nodes. So however we want to do it, we could even duplicate each node a few times if we want. And that's all well and good. So more or less, exporting works the same. Now I want to show one of the annoying parts about C# in Godot at the moment. So when you declare a class name in Gdscript and you go to add a child node, it's going to show up automatically. So you can see wizard here. We got our wizardplayer.gd, and all you need to do inside of wizard player at the top is declare a class name and it will be picked up. That also applies to resources. However, in C#, if you want your classes to be registered like that, there's a plugin out there for it right now, a Godot Mono Custom Resource Registry from @links. So you can see that it is possible to register custom types from C#. And I'm not sure when this would be, but you can see up here at the top that there was a request to add global class support for C# in Godot. But right now it's a little annoying. So where that can be even more annoying is when you're dealing with resources. And let me show you what I mean. So here I have a stats resource in Gdscript, right? So it extends resource, it has the class name stats. If I want to create a stats resource, I just click on Gdscript, create new resource, and let's look for stats. So new or test stats, I'll just call it teststats.tres. So if I double click on this file, this is a stats resource. It's got all of the stats in here, all of the export variables, and you can use the signal and whatnot. So it's easy to create and easy to reference. So I think in player script, I have an export for a stats resource. So let's put player GD on the guy. And now you can see that we need a stats resource to assign. So I can quick load the test stats. Or I can click here and I can create a new stats. So the typing for these resources works, and it's going to reflect that in the context menu. So I can load that in there, and then I can edit my stats, and I won't be able to accidentally assign something that's not stats here, which is handy. So of course you can have typed resources inside of C#, but in the same way that you can't have your classes pop up here and create new node, it's also not going to show up when you're creating resources or you want to reference a specific resource type that is from C# in this context menu for stats. So let's create a stats C#. I'll just create a new script here. And this is going to inherit from resources. And it's going to be stats.cs. So let's create that. I'll double click into here. And let's just give it one export. So export here. And then we're going to have, let's say, public integer. And we'll say health. And that's going to be equal to 100. So now let's go back out. And we want to create a resource with that, right? So let's build the project to make sure that it would show up. But if we now create this in the root of our project, create new resource, we'll see that stats.gd is a type we can create, but stats.cs does not pop up here. So if you want to assign the stats script to the resource, you have to create a base resource like this, and we'll say stats cs test.tres and the root, save. Okay, so we have this resource, we give it the script, so it takes stats and drop this in here, and there we have our stats resource. So you can see how that's a little bit more annoying not having it pop up there in the menu automatically. If you're willing to download and use the plugin, then obviously that will help fix that, but out of the box, a little bit more of a pain. And now, if we want to use this stats type, so if we go back in here, even though this has a clear class name, stats, let's go into Wizard Player and let's give it that stats resource. So export, and then we're going to have public stats. So the specific designated stats resource, not just a normal resource. And this will be stats get, let's just say private stat, why not? And let's save that. So for the guy, I'm going to take Wizard Player .cs. I'll drop that in there. You see that we still have to compile. So let's compile it so that it will show up here. And now this stats resource, if we click here, it's not going to know about those C# typings. So even though we declared a class name, which of course you have to do all the time in C#, we don't have the menu being filtered here, which means that there's just way too many types to create for. And this stats down here is actually Gdscript stats. So the only way we can assign it out of the box that I know of is we have to basically drag and drop, or you can click here and go all the way to the bottom and quick load, but then this also gives you any resource. You can see even scripts show up here because scripts are actually a resource in Godot. So we take stats.cs test and drop that in there, and we can click here and we have the fields here, and technically everything works fine. It's just a little harder to kind of lock down exactly the right types for the right objects and having that verification to know that you're just not assigning a random resource and assigning the right one there. So definitely keep that in mind if you're going to use C# for Godot. Okay, so if you've been using Godot, you probably know about signals. So signals are kind of like events for Godot. So when something happens, you can emit a signal. As you can see in the setter function, when the HP changed, I emit the HP's changed signals. And any other class that connects or subscribes to this HP changed signal / event is going to receive the data, which is the new value float. So signals are great, and we can also use them in C#. So if we go over to stats.cs, let's create a signal up here at the top. So signals still basically work the same, but writing them is a little different. So we'd write signal up here to declare that we are creating a signal, and we're going to do that out of a public delegate void. And we want the name of our signal. So let's just say health changed, and then you have to say event handler. And then at the end, you write the parameters of the event. So let's do integer, new health. Oh, sorry, because that's a field. It should be camel case. So new health and semicolon at the end. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a health changed event with this parameters that it's expecting. And then you can subscribe to the health changed signal, basically like you would in Gdscript. So let's see, we have the wizard player, which has stats. So since we have the stats resource accessible here, let's override. So public override the _ready function. So on ready, we want to connect to that signal inside of there. So we're going to do stats dot. So you can see the signal here, or basically an event is what you would generally call them in C#. And so we have stats health changed, and we want to plus equals the function that we want to call when health is changed from within this class. So let's create a private function that can respond to that. So we'll do a private void _ on health changed. And so we get the parameters. So the parameters have to be the same in C# as what you would expect from health changed. You can't just randomly drop the parameters. So we'll have a float, and that's going to be new health. And then we implement whatever we want in the function. So let's take this name here and put that there. Okay, and we have a issue here. No overload matches the delegate. Okay, so let me go ahead and check that. Delegate void, health changed event handler, new health. Okay, it's because the typing has to be the same. So inside of wizard player, we got to make sure that the float is actually an int. So now in this method that responds to the health being changed, we could do something like print out to the console. So just like in Gdscript, you can still use Gdscript printing. So we can do GD, which is the global Godot object, which gives us access to things like print or print error, or let's see, push error, push warning, which is probably what you want to do so that these messages pop up in the Godot debugger. So you could do like push warning, push error, which doesn't really make sense here. So we'll just do print. Okay, so let's actually show that this signal works by telling the stats to emit the health changed event or signal. So let's create another node real quick. So in C#, I'm going to create a new script, and I'll say stats health changed emitter. So inside of the C# folder, I'm just going to create a new script here, and I'll just call this something like health manager, which inherits from node. So let's put that somewhere in our game. Let's open up the world, and I'll add a child node. So let's see, node. And then let's add in our guy scene. So of course, I can make that editable, and you can see all of the nodes inside of there. So we have the wizard player CS. And this node script, I want to make that a health manager. So I'm going to attach the health manager script, and let's go ahead and edit that health manager script. So the health manager script is going to have a public stats get set, or maybe get private set actually. So just a reference to the resource file. And then let's do public override _ ready. And you'll notice that these functions that we're overriding, like ready, or you can also do public override, let's see, like enter tree, exit tree, or underscore physics process or process. Those are the same node functions that you would see in Gdscript. So basically, you're still working with Godot. It's just a different language, but accessing the same built-in GD functionality. Okay, so on ready, we want to emit the stats event or stats signal. So let's do stats dot, and let's say emit signal. So we need to give it the name of the signal. So the signal name was health changed, and we could give it a value here. So, I mean, you could do it like this, but that doesn't really make that much sense. It makes a lot more sense if the signal emission actually comes out of the class here. So first off, let's make this field private. And then over in Health Manager, if we do something like stats.health, you'll see that it doesn't even show up here. You can't mess with the health field now because it's private. So back in here, we'll make this a underscore, a private field. The underscore just to indicate that it's private, but this is what actually matters here, the private. And because we have the private field, if we want to set the health, we now need a property. So I'll do a public int health. So we're going to need a getter function. So we can return the underscore health, and that's easy enough. But we may also want a setter function. So our setter, we can say health equals the new value. So we don't need to put in the parameter. Value is just implied here. And then when the health changes, we can just emit the signal. So emit signal, health changed, and the new value will be underscore health. So now, if we want the signal to get emitted, we just need to change the stats value. So we can do that in the health manager. And we'll say stats.health equals 50. Okay, so on ready, the stats is going to get set. And then over in stats, this signal is going to be emitted from the setter function of the health. And that's going to mean that the wizard player is going to respond to that with the onHealth changed private function, which should spit the new health out to the console. Okay, so let's build the project and actually test that. So we'll select the current one as the main scene. You can see it always has to build the project, and we get the project going, a debugger, errors, object reference not set to an object. Oh, of course, because we have to actually assign the resource on Health Manager. So, okay, there you see once again, a little annoying to assign resources, but we can just drag the resource if we know what it is into here, compile and run. So when we run this thing, you can still, it still actually doesn't show the message here. Okay, so the reason actually that we're not getting a message here is because when we call this on the ready function, that we haven't waited for everything else to be ready in the scene, like the wizard player. So the wizard player hasn't actually connected yet. So that's just something you need to be careful about in general. That's not specifically C#. So if you wanted to get around that, then on, let's see, the health manager. So what we actually want to do here is defer the setting of the health value until all the other nodes have run their on ready, so that the wizard player is going to be connected. So we'll do stats.setDeferred, and then we give it the property name, which is health, and then the value 50. Okay, that should give it time for the wizard player to catch up with its on ready. Let's run it and see if that works. Okay, so we run. Okay, and then we have the value spit out to the console. So that's just a little gotcha if you ever try to emit a signal from a ready function. You want to make sure everything else is ready first. So you can see that signals work basically the same way as they would in Gdscript as well. It's just that the syntax is a little bit different, a lot more curly braces. But really, from what I've seen, basically anything you can do in C#, you can also do in Gdscript. Gdscript doesn't enforce everything like private functions and variables, or your class name has to match the file name, as in the case of all these CS files. So it's much more like Python as a language. C# is statically typed. You have to compile C# every time you make a change and you run it so the code executes. But hopefully I could give at least a rough overview of some of the differences in actually using C# in Godot and what that would look like compared to Gdscript. So from here, I'd probably recommend checking out libraries. So for instance, when it comes to Godot, since Gdscript is obviously what it was built, and if you go into the asset library, there's going to be a lot more Gdscript-based plugins that you can use. Now, obviously, there are also plugins that have been mirrored to C# and some that are C# in general. So what I've been kind of playing around with is Paradise Motion. So if we look at Paradise, we can see all of Banana Hologramma's scripts here. There's C# and there's the Godot script version. So in some cases, you'd be fine going either way. And one of the cool things about Godot, and I didn't really cover it in this video, but you can cross-script between the languages. So a C# script can grab properties and fields from a Gdscript. So if you have an exported field that's in Gdscript, maybe it has something like a health value, and you have a C# script, your C# script can actually grab that value. So they're not incompatible with each other now. And I think that uses a lot of strings for accessing the properties cross-language, which isn't the nicest, but it can work. So a project can definitely have Gdscript and C# script combined into one. So you can play around with both, see what you like best. I do think the lack of automatic class name registration for resources and node types is pretty annoying right now. But I'll definitely be keeping an eye on C# in the months and years to come and see if it kind of catches up for everything with Gdscript. So if you've made it to the end, thanks for watching this video. I hope I gave you guys some idea of the differences between C# and Gdscript and how they would actually apply inside of your game project. So I've been Chris, and I will see you guys in my future video content.